Thought Leadership from PwC's National Office.
Hello, and welcome back to PwC's Accounting Podcast. I'm Heather Horn, PwC's U.S. Sustainability Technical Leader, and this is Sustainability Now. Today, we're revisiting the topic of energy with a focus on the levelized costs of electricity, or LCOE. Well, it may sound technical. LCOE has wide-reaching implications. It's a key metric used to determine which power plants are built, how investments in energy are made, and even what shows up on your monthly electric bill. Understanding this topic will be important as you look ahead to transition plans and your sustainability reporting. I'm joined today by Karl Hausker, Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute's Polsky Center for the Global Energy Transition, to unpack what LCOE really means and why it matters to you. And one quick note before we dive in. If you'd like to watch the video version of this conversation, you'll find a link in the show notes. And particularly for today's episode, you may want to check those out because it actually will come with some bonus slides that will help us understand what Karl really means. So Karl, welcome. So nice to have you here.
Great to be here, Heather. Thanks.
So Karl, before we dive into the details, can you just share a bit with our listeners on your background and how you really came to this topic?
Sure. Yes, I've been a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute about 12 years, and that comes as part of a 30-year career working on climate change and clean energy, starting off on Capitol Hill back in the late 80s, early 90s, and then I went to EPA under President Clinton and served as the deputy in the policy office there. And since then, I've done consulting at firms and nonprofits and have, like I say, been 12 years at WRI working on these issues with a focus on the power sector.
Very interesting for many of our listeners, especially who are relatively new to sustainability reporting and focusing on some of these issues. It's always, I think, nice to be reminded that there have been people focused on this for quite some time. So appreciate that. And then in addition, can you just share a little bit for our listeners on what the World Resources Institute Polsky Center is and what you're focused on?
Yes. World Resources Institute as a whole is amazing green think tank and do tank. We have over 2,000 employees across 8 offices, including the U.S., China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, and with also staff in Europe and in Africa. And we work on all aspects of sustainability: climate change, energy, food, forests, oceans, water issues, other land issues. And it is an organization that not only does cutting-edge research and publishes amazing reports on these issues, but also is a do tank. We really try to get down on the ground, making change happen in the countries that we work in.
All right, so definitely a lot to think about, and it's very appropriate we're having this conversation during New York Climate Week. So I may ask you a few questions about that at the end. And I can't resist asking you this question to start. So as soon as someone hears that you're working on this topic, do they say, oh, so you must spend all your time focused on renewable energy?
No, in fact, there's a full suite of low and zero carbon electricity sources that I'm working on and my colleagues in and out of World Resources Institute, with the main thrust being, in order to solve the climate change problem, we need to dramatically increase global electricity supplies on an order of 2 or 3 times what we're producing now by 2050. We need to use that electricity to decarbonize other sectors like transportation with electric vehicles, buildings with heat pumps, and industry also with heat pumps and other applications. We need electricity potentially to make hydrogen. So vastly increased electricity supplies are key to solving climate change. At the same time, of course, we need to move entirely to low carbon and zero carbon sources of that electricity. That's the big challenge that takes us a long way to solving climate change.
Yeah, because I think when most people think about, again, thinking about our audience, when most of them are thinking about increases in electricity, they're immediately thinking increased emissions. But what you're saying is actually net, if we're using the right sources of electricity, we can actually decrease emissions and by cleaning up other sectors. Is that a fair summary?
That's the trick we have to pull off.
All right, that's quite a trick. So, Karl, then a bit with that background, I sort of teased this in the opener. We're here today to spend some of our time talking about this levelized cost of electricity. But before we get into what exactly that is, maybe you can help us understand for our non-energy focused listeners why it matters to all, to everyone in business.
Right. There are a lot of pieces of the puzzle of decarbonizing the electricity sector. LCOE is one piece of that puzzle, but it's an important one to understand because LCOE numbers are thrown around by a lot of people, and they're also misinterpreted and misused often. That's why I devote some of my time to it.
Okay, thank you. So then with that, what exactly is this metric?
Yeah. What is the levelized cost of electricity, LCOE? It's a simple metric that is probably best understood as an effort to estimate the average cost of power from a generating source. And what it does is in the numerator of the formula, it is all of the costs, the capital cost, operating costs, fuel costs, taken on a present value basis, discounted over the life of the power plant. And then the denominator of this metric is the sum of all the megawatt hours produced by that generating plant. Also discounted, physically discounting units, which we can come back to. But when you divide the cost by the quantity of electricity, you can envision it sort of as this average cost of power from a generating plant. It seems very straightforward. However, what it overlooks is that not all megawatt hours are created equal among different power plants. Some power plants are base load and put out megawatt hours throughout the year in a steady stream, except for occasional outages. Other power plants are deliberately operated in some kind of ramping capability where they ramp up to meet load, they ramp down. And then what's happened over the last 10 or 15 years, as I'm sure all of our listeners know, is that solar and wind have become very cheap. However, solar power, of course, is only available for half the day, and then its output drops to zero at night. And its output also varies depending on clouds and on the season of the year. More production in summer, less production in winter. Similarly, wind has a production pattern all of its own, a very sort of stochastic production pattern depending on weather and wind speeds. So it is the sort of one of the flaws of using LCOE to say what is the cost of output from a power plant is that different power plants bring very different value to the grid.
So maybe if I take a step back and try to understand that, if I'm thinking about, for example, the solar plant, then the cost of each megawatt of electricity that I'm producing is basically capital cost divided by divided over the expected output from the plant over its life with some discounting. Is that fair?
Correct.
And then, but whereas if I'm talking about a coal plant, then I'm thinking the capital costs, there's more operations and maintenance costs, there's also the fuel costs. And so you're saying that maybe on the surface, oh, well, here's this solar megawatt maybe is cheaper than my coal megawatt, also comes with less emissions, but they're serving much different purposes in powering our electric grid.
Exactly. Of course, their emissions are different, and we're trying to get emissions down, and solar's features on that front are great. But you put your finger on the key thing, which is solar has mostly upfront capital costs. We do a present value on that and some fairly small operating costs, no fuel costs, divide by the total output over 20-25 year life of the solar plant, and you get a number. And for a utility scale solar plant, that is typically $30, $40, $50 a megawatt hour. But of course, it is only available some hours of the year. The coal plant will tend to run flat out most of the year. Most coal plants have some ramping capability, which provides more value. And then we take the present value of, as you said, the capital costs, operating maintenance and the fuel costs. Coal plants will have a much higher LCOE, could be $100, $150
Wow.
a megawatt hour.
And then I guess, again, for the benefit of our listeners who aren't following the electricity markets, can you just give a sense of the cost of electricity today, if maybe we're recording this in New York? So in this market in general, obviously it fluctuates widely, but just to give a sense of how these numbers fit in.
Yeah. What is the cost of electricity? Even that question is hard to answer, because we have, like, what can answer it is what is sort of the wholesale production cost that the New York ISO might report. You have retail rates, which are much higher because they incorporate the distribution system and other costs. But across the country, we might see range of retail prices ranging from maybe under 10 cents a kilowatt hour in some states up to 25, 30 cents kilowatt hour in places like California, and a whole range in between. The key thing, of course, is to what we as a society care about is not the cost of an individual power plant, however that's measured, but the system cost, how all those power plants play together to create reliable electricity, meet our environmental goals, whatever they are in terms of emissions of sulfur dioxide and NOx or carbon dioxide, and then try to minimize the cost to consumers of providing that electricity at the system level.
Right. And so that's where I think that's some of the policy questions come in as well. And if I rewind to 20 years ago, I think that's right around the right time when a lot of states were putting in place these renewable mandates, and otherwise that's when we started to see this shift. But now it's much more complicated. We have a lot of new types of uses coming onto the grid. And again, just focusing here in the US, not thinking of a global problem. Reliability is such a huge issue. And then the interplay of these more intermittent resources with the base load and otherwise. And so how does the LCOE fit in with all these other policy questions that a regulator is trying to answer?
Yes, regulators and utilities, and then independent power producers who are not part of a utility operating grid, they all have to look at cost. And the regulator, of course, has the job of trying to minimize the utility rates, the utility's total costs. The utility comes to the regulators with a plan. Here's what we're going to do next year. Here's a 10-year expansion plan for the future. And the utility, again, is trying to minimize costs. If they put forth a dumb plan, the regulator is going to give it the thumbs down. And then the IPPs, the independent power producers, are bidding into wholesale markets in places like the New York ISO or PJM or ISO New England. And they are also looking at their costs and what kind of bid can they make to win a contract or establish a power purchase agreement with a large buyer. But the key thing here is that LCOE is not used as a decision tool by any of the players in these real roles with responsibility for building or operating and overseeing a grid. It's a metric that's tossed around a lot, but talk to any utility or any IPP, they don't make decisions based on the LCOE of a particular generating plant.
Okay, I have a follow-up question, but just to keep our listeners, for them to keep up, Karl referenced the New York ISO, PJM, and just for your benefit, those are really operating the transmission systems is probably the most simplistic way to describe that.
Right. They are a regional transmission organization, are almost equally described as an independent system operator. In those states, there are fairly high levels of deregulation of the generation sector. And so those organizations create markets for power at the wholesale level.
And make sure that the system is operating the way it should, which I think is,
transmission and
yes,
keep the lights on.
keep the lights on. And I think for most of our listeners, that's probably the most important thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, Karl, let me go back to the question I was going to ask you, because you made a very interesting point, which is that none of the people responsible for keeping the lights on and maintaining the electric system are actually using LCOE. So how is LCOE being used, and how would you think it should be used?
Yeah, let me start with how it should be used.
Okay.
And I'll just amend my comment just briefly to say, when I talk to, again, real-world decision makers at utilities, grid operators, IPPs, at best, they might use LCOE as an initial screening tool in terms of what should we be thinking about in terms of generation options. But that's as far as it goes. And I would like to quote from a study by the National Renewable Energy Lab that really lays out how LCOE should be used. And this is a 2021 paper that your viewers can look in the show notes for the link. They say LCOE is an incomplete metric. LCOE is not designed to capture a technology's full economic value to the system, as I mentioned before, and LCOE is commonly used to communicate technology comparisons. This use can be appropriate to track the cost and performance progress of a single technology over time, or to compare technologies that operate similarly and that primarily provide energy services, just pure megawatt hours. This is really important because they say that's how it's appropriate to use it. So don't compare different technologies unless they operate very similarly in terms of the value they deliver to the grid. This was echoed by a report by the Energy Information Administration 2023 report that said, quote, direct comparisons of LCOE across technologies are misleading as a method to assess economic competitiveness. That's how all experts say LCOE should be used. And this is like, if we look in the literature, we'll see that the LCOE of solar tracked across different years has come down amazingly over the last 10 or 15 years. It used to be over $100 a megawatt hour. Now it's down into that $30, $40, $50 a megawatt hour range. Great news. Similarly, you can track the cost of wind. We had some pretty big cost reductions in the 2000s. It's continued to inch down in the 2010s and into the 2025s. Now, $40, $50, $60 a megawatt hour. If it's offshore, it's higher. But again, it's good to track a single technology over time to see what's happening to the average cost coming out, but not comparing across technologies unless it's they're operating very similarly, delivering similar value to the grid. So you asked, how is it used?
Yes.
What's out there? Why do I focus on this? And what happens so often is that a company or organization that produces these LCOE estimates will just throw them up on one graphic or one table or one chart that shows all the LCOE of very different methods. I have an example in the slides of the latest report by Lazard, very high-profile publisher of these estimates. And what you see is, here's the cost of solar, LCOE. Here's the cost of wind. Here's the cost of offshore wind. Here's the cost of a gas peaking plant. Gas peaking plants come in very high, well over $100 a megawatt hour. Here's the cost of a coal plant, a nuclear plant, a geothermal plant. And they throw them all up on one graph, and typically then the authors of the report will say, renewables are the cheapest power source, or renewables are cost competitive with fossil fuels. And those statements are true using the LCOE metric of dollars per megawatt hour, but that contradicts exactly what the NREL and EIA studies said, don't compare across technologies. So it creates a sort of false comparison of power plants that need to play together to deliver that reliable, affordable power.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So regular listeners will probably have heard me say before, when I started as an auditor, I'm going to date myself in the 90s, I had a large wind company was one of my clients, and they had to have a lot of incentives and still really was not the most profitable technology. And then it's been so interesting as someone who's followed this to see these costs going down and the fact that all this investment in technology really has paid off when it comes to that. And from a broader policy perspective, then it makes sense. These are, basically zero emissions, low emission sources. But what you're saying is, okay, that's good. And yes, that does make sense. But now in 2025, as we're thinking about what different sources to add and where we should focus, you can't use that number to do that.
Right. You should not make a simplistic conclusion that we should only build this technology because it has the lowest LCOE. And I want to emphasize that I don't want to come across as anti-renewable in any way, because the cost decreases that we have been talking about mean that in future grids, 10, 20 years from now, we might be able to have solar and wind be the backbone of a zero carbon grid. Maybe we can get to 50% solar and wind. In Australia, maybe they can get to 90% or more. Some countries maybe to 70%. But the key thing is that solar and wind, which is variable or intermittent in its output, has to be complemented by things like storage, demand-side management, and clean, firm generating sources, sources that we can control running it in a baseload mode or a ramping mode. And those clean, firm sources, the necessary complement to solar and wind, will inherently have a higher LCOE. So the zero carbon grids that we'd all like to get to are going to have a mixture of technologies, some with high, medium, and low LCOEs.
So let me ask you a question then, just again to keep our audience with us. So when we say clean, firm, that means it's low emissions, but it's also available when I need it. So it's I'm not dependent on an outside source like the sun or the wind. Right.
Not weather dependent. No technology is available 100% of the time, all the time. Yes. We all know about unforced outages or forced outages. But of course, there's a dramatic difference between a solar plant that might have a 25% capacity factor because of weather, a wind plant that has a 40 or 45% capacity factor versus a nuclear plant or a gas plant that has carbon capture, low emissions, but is very controllable and dispatchable. It's really there when you need it, far more than the variable output of solar and wind.
So where does LCOE fit into this discussion then, or does it not?
Yeah. Well, I'll give, I mentioned the publishers of LCOE estimates, and that includes Lazard, Wood Mackenzie, Bloomberg, but also international organizations like IEA, International Energy Administration, or the International Renewable Administration. And what bothers me is that these organizations and then the media will make fairly simplistic statements based on throwing all the numbers on one graph or one table. A quote from the IEA executive director said, onshore wind and solar photovoltaics are cheaper today than new fossil fuel plants almost everywhere. They're even cheaper than the existing fossil fuel plants, just their operating costs in most countries. Also, when media reports on the annual Lazard estimates, they will say solar and wind retain the lowest LCOEs. Or another media outlet said fossil fuels cost more than unsubsidized wind and solar. That's what Lazard says. And what this creates in my mind a false narrative that says that implies let's just build the cheapest stuff on an LCOE basis, and gets away from this idea of what is the mix or the team of power plants we need going forward. Now, in some cases, to meet an increment of demand, building solar and storage or wind and storage might be the best option. And in fact, over the next couple of years, as demand is now growing again at 2% a year or more, often the short term, the near term build out, the lowest cost option might be typically solar with storage, wind storage. Of course, gas combined cycle plants are also in big demand now as demand soars, short lead time, low LCOE. But again, LCOE is not the determinant of what utilities need to do. And the other thing that worries me about simplistic interpretations that let's just build what's cheap is it may undercut the need to build first of a kind, second of a kind plants to demonstrate and commercialize advanced nuclear plants, gas with CCS plants, geothermal plants, all that will come in initially at a relatively high LCOE, but then will come down over time as they demonstrate their ability.
Similar to what we talked about with the solar and wind, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you said gas with LCC, right?
Oh, sorry, with CCS, carbon capture and storage.
I was thinking low carbon, but yes, carbon capture and storage. So let me ask a question then. If I take a step, well, I have a few, but if I take a step back, many of our listeners are not in a decision-making capacity here, but they're focused for their own company on their transition plans, on achieving net zero, and the overall objectives of lowering emissions. So what role then do companies have to play in this discussion, particularly where what we see is for most companies, their number one way to reduce emissions related to their scope 2 or electricity emissions is to go buy renewable energy credits. So how does that fit together then?
Yeah, you're raising some really interesting questions that relate, of course, to scope 2 emissions. And we're in the middle of a revision of the GHG protocol, which WRI plays a huge role in and managing that revision. And it's again, some very technical concepts in terms of how should we define scope 2 emissions? And up till now, companies have been able to claim a lower scope 2 footprint by buying renewable energy, or literally simply the renewable energy certificates, the RECs. In my view, this has been a very important way to stimulate the wind and solar industry over the last 10 or 15 years, but also it's widely acknowledged that just purchasing a REC or entering a PPA for renewable power somewhere, maybe even distant from your factory, may or may not save a lot of carbon or really reduce emissions. And this is why some large buyers of electricity have been advocating and moving toward what's called 24/7 carbon-free electricity purchasing, where they really track when their renewable power is purchased and how it is affecting the grid and backing out gas or coal. It's a more sophisticated and costly approach to tracking your scope 2 emissions, and this is something that's being debated literally as we speak in terms of how the GHG protocol should evolve over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually recorded an episode earlier this week with two of my partners who are working in the GHG area, and we were debating scope 2, and particularly our personal views on market-based, the use of that market-based method. And I think we see it has its place, but because it's not representative of what's physically occurring, I think all three of us at least have some concerns. And so it will be interesting to see what the GHG protocol comes out with in their proposal, which I think is coming soon.
Yeah, it will be out for public comment pretty soon.
Yeah.
And going back to your question about, should individual companies outside of the power sector, what should they care about LCOE? Should they position? It's a more, I think, an indirect role in that as customers of utilities, they want reliable power, of course. Most companies want to see us decarbonize in the power sector, and they want it done at lowest cost. So as they participate in public utility proceedings and affect how market design in PJM or the integrated resource plan of a utility, I would advocate that they advocate again for looking at system costs and that mixture of plants needed, and not be sort of taken in by the LCOE myth that, the PUC should just approve lowest LCOE and end of discussion. That is a path actually ultimately to higher system costs and less reliable systems.
Yeah, so it's an interesting point. Again, we deal with a lot of companies that are either now trying to buy this type of 24/7 low carbon power, or that are solely focused on RECs and otherwise. And what you're seeing is actually there's also a policy role here, where a lot of times I think those plans that are presented to the Public Utilities Commission, there's hearings and otherwise, and companies are more focused on these other mechanisms, but you're saying actually they have a voice to play there as well.
Should have a voice to play. And that actually leads me to another observation, which is there something better than LCOE to use? And I've looked at some of the other metrics that are sort of a variation on LCOE, and they all get more complex and don't really solve the problem. In other words, you can never look at an individual power plant, do a cost metric, tweak it a little bit. Oh, let's maybe try to pull in some reliability features or pull in the value. You'll in the literature, you will see variations on LCOE, but none of them can really be a replacement for a more complex computer model that looks at what's often called a capacity expansion model that utilities will run, consulting firms will run. PUCs sometimes have in-house models or need to oversee the use of these models that, again, look at all options and how they fit together and try to minimize system cost, sometimes called minimizing present value of revenue requirements in the kind of regulated utility context. So there isn't, I kind of wish there was a shortcut to make LCOE better, but I haven't found one. And so we need to all be more sophisticated looking at capacity expansion models and system costs, and not be misled by
like a number,
LCOE.
Yeah. All right. So definitely some education probably needed for all of us on that. So let me ask you one final question. At the very beginning of the conversation, I jotted this down because you mentioned that you are involved in looking, when I asked you about renewables, you said, no, this wider focus on low carbon, no carbon sources of power. And I do think just a few headlines on that may be interesting for our listeners to hear where you think some of that may be going.
Yeah. When I look across the different studies of how we get to that, literally to net zero as the entire economy, global studies, national studies, and sometimes even state level studies, there's actually sort of a remarkable convergence among them that I noted a little bit at the outset, that we need to produce a whole lot more electricity because we can drive EVs and reduce emissions in the transport sector. We can buy heat pumps, reduce our building use, et cetera, et cetera. But then when it comes to how do we still have a reliable power system, most of the studies show that at a global level, if we can really build a lot of wind and solar and overcome some of the local siting issues, we could get to maybe 75% solar and wind globally. But we need to complement it with other things. And fortunately, we have a number of things to choose from. Hydro is zero carbon. It's a firm source, and sometimes it can be ramped up and down depending on reservoir levels. But hydro can't scale up much more than where we are now. We've already built in most of the good sources globally, and certainly in the U.S. Biomass is sometimes touted as a clean, firm source. And yes, if you sort of do your GHG accounting, you're pulling carbon out of the air when you grow a plant. When you burn it, you're just returning the carbon to the air. Yes, but a massive scale-up of biomass would also compete with food production and biodiversity. So yes, biomass can play a niche role, but it can't really scale up in the way we need. But we have really promising developments in geothermal recently, particularly out west in the U.S., And over time, we think we'll probably be able to drill deeper and deeper and create these artificial, essentially man-made um, uh, heat areas to pump water down, boil it, spin a turbine. So that's probably going to be scalable, very encouraging. Nuclear, as I'm sure our listeners know, is really experiencing a huge surge in interest and investment, ranging from everything from bringing old nuclear reactors out of retirement, which can be done quickly, but there's only a certain limited number of those, to AP1000 reactors, which are being built in different places in the world, China, India, Middle East, at reasonable cost. But Europe and the US sort of have lost the muscle memory on how to build a large reactor at reasonable cost. Okay, can we recover that? I hope so. And then we have this whole range of 1 megawatt to 10 megawatt to 300 megawatt and everything in between, small modular reactor companies moving those technologies ahead, getting some interest again from large buyers, entering power purchase agreements or making equity investments to develop that. So nuclear is a scalable, clean, firm resource. There are risks, of course. You have to manage the waste safely. You have to manage the proliferation risks. You have to manage the day-to-day operation risks. And of course, some people view those as unacceptable risks. And of course, that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, that's another policy question.
Yeah. And then finally, fossil fuel, either gas or coal, with carbon capture and storage to bring the emissions down, reduce them by 90 or 95%. It's being piloted in many places in the world, and it can probably play a role too. And again, it's scalable, unlike hydro and biomass.
Yeah, it's interesting if we go back to the discussion on the large decrease in the cost of solar and wind and the role they're playing now. It's almost like we need to move on and now focus on all these other technologies and see what can happen 20 years from now in terms of the cost and otherwise for those. So very optimistic note, I think, to end on.
Yeah. Let me just put one more metaphor, which is walking and chewing gum at the same time. Again, in the next couple of years, probably the smartest thing we can do to meet AI demand and other growth is to build a lot of solar and wind with storage. But at the same time, we need to move forward with the first of a kind, second of a kind, and beyond demonstrations of the clean, firm technologies, see how they perform, see how they scale, and be ready to deploy them in the 2030s. Because we will need, again, to find those optimal generation mixes of clean, firm, and intermittent as we go forward.
All right. Well, very interesting. I really appreciate you taking the time, Karl. Thanks so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. All right. And thank you to our listeners at Slash Viewers for joining us today as well. As always, I encourage you to subscribe on your favorite channel to make sure you never miss any of our episodes, and to also subscribe to our newsletter at viewpoint.pwc.com. Thanks again for joining us today.